So we can move to the first panel of the conference, which is a panel on philosophy and history. I'm gonna be the moderator, so I'm gonna introduce first of all Thomas Blank. Thomas Blank is professor. He shared with me this morning a very funny short video. So, yeah, is professor of cultural history of Greco-Roman antiquity at Johannes Gutenberg-University at Mainz, Germany. Before taking that position in 2016, he held a junior professorship of ancient Greek history at Saarland University and worked as a research and teaching assistant at Tübingen and Mainz universities. His research is focused on identity formation through public discourse with a specific view on rhetoric and intellectualism in ancient Athens, and on the social functions of religious secrecy. He is a speaker of our research training group on the dynamics of differentiating strangers from citizens in pre-modern cities, and is part of a cluster of excellence investigating the dynamics of neighborliness, or something like that. He's Secretary General of the International Society for the History of Rhetoric and founding president of an International Society of Isocratian Studies. His elder, this is the funniest part, his eldest daughter of 6 years has recently developed a habit of being bored quite often and of expressing all kinds of negative emotions, such as anger, for example, through the language of boredom. So she inspires her younger brothers to do the same. Tell us more about that, Thomas. The floor is yours.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you. So I'm glad to be able to present today. And also I'm new to this society, so I feel I should state the starting position of the cultural historian from which I am approaching my topic today, highlighting 3 aspects that may seem rather trivial, yet should be stated to prevent misunderstanding. First, there is the historicity of emotion. If boredom is acknowledged as a defining experience of our time or of modern times, we might rightly imply that it may not have been at other times, at least not in the same form or by the same concept. History, in a sense, is a different country, and historical cultures are different cultures. Many of the external factors that trigger emotions, like boredom, may not be specific to a given culture, but the circumstances under which we are exposed to, for example, situations in which we are forced into inactivity, heavily depend on cultural systems and on social structures. More importantly, while of course there may be structural similarities between situations, and of course we can trace bodily as well as mental reactions to such situations, and all of this is crucial for understanding boredom in its universal aspects in particular, there will still be differences in how human beings make sense of that absence of activity or agency, how they apply symbolic meaning to such situations, for example, by defining them as nonsensical, as unbearable, as annoying, exhausting, etc., by extrapolating the reasons that supposedly force us into such non-activity, or, on a rather different note, what one should make of such situations. These systems of meaning that are involved in the perception of boredom are determined by cultural premises, and those may change, or I should say, those will necessarily change over time. In this sense, we should expect the boredom of people of the distant past to be a culturally different boredom, to a certain degree at least, and to study it may be interesting from a comparative perspective. Second, we cannot interview historical persons about their perceptions of their own emotions. We can only interpret what direct or indirect statements they uttered on their own accord. What we can also study are the cultural frameworks I was talking about, the frameworks within which concepts of boredom are developed and expressed. And this relates to my third preliminary remark. I do have a list of these here. If all that historians can study are the products of discourse and practice that were originally unrelated to our research questions, what is it then that has come down to us and can be studied? We certainly do not have coherent sets of empirical data for any research question concerning societies of the distant past. And depending on certain circumstance and the question, the type and amount of our data may differ considerably. Let us hypothesize a fictional society of the past in which there was a strong taboo on talking about boredom. Well, such a taboo would certainly have had an impact on the traces that boredom would have left in the historical record. This would not mean that boredom did not exist in the emotional reality of said society. What we historically have at our hand is not an innocent representation of a past reality, but it has been selected by the filters of culture and of historical tradition. And the further we reach down into the past, the more filters will have been involved. Now, that may sound a bit pessimistic coming from a historian who studies societies 2 millennia in the past, yet it is important to understand those premises under which I need to approach my material, because they're of methodical importance, of course. There are two potential paths I see to take if you're looking out for traces that boredom may have left in the Greco-Roman historical record. The first and more obvious is the study of explicit literary reflections about boredom, or whatever we might wish to call the similar concepts that were relevant in those ages. There have been a rather small number of studies addressing such texts. The list may not contain each and every publication, but it's quite comprehensive already. Those studies are all struggling with the problem that there is no single term that would be close to or congruent to with modern notions of boredom. The most prominent term discussed as a proto-concept of boredom is the Greek term akedia. That, however, is a term that is exclusively discussed by philosophers and, to a much larger degree, by latently critique theology. And there it is addressed as a moral flaw against which to define normative moral concepts. Now give me a second, I need to move on with... Okay, I should use the other version I have here because somehow... Oh no, it now works, sorry. Other terms like tedium, Latin, or nausea slightly resemble French ennui, but they contain a maybe even stronger element of revulsion or disgust. A person who suffers from tedium vitae will not be bored as much as they will be sick of living and might even consider suicide. But to cut it short, while thinking about such concepts may be interesting enough, concepts like akedia have left surprisingly little traces outside theoretical discussions of ancient thinkers. And since, as a cultural historian, I am exactly interested in the interplay of concepts on the one and human practice and social reality on the other hand, I've taken the second path in looking out for traces of boredom. I asked myself, what would motivate a person in ancient society to express their own boredom in the first place, to communicate their emotion? That question is far from trivial because of some marked cultural differences between modern industrial societies and Greco-Roman antiquity. Importantly, in Greek and Roman antiquity, public discourse was centered around social and political life to a much larger degree than we are used to. Everything and everybody who was not part of that public sphere, including children and, to a lesser degree, women, slaves, or foreigners, would be radically underrepresented in public discourse, as would be statements about one's own personal emotions, at least if they weren't directly related to public life. Certainly, ancient people individually strived for personal well-being no less than those of other ages and cultures. But there was no established culture of talking about individual self-fulfillment or even the private persona. There are a few exceptions, but they don't relate to boredom. Male citizens in particular, who produced the vast bulk of the written texts that have come down to us, define themselves as public persons, as active political citizens. So to talk about one's inactivity in terms of boredom would mean to negate one of the most important sources of public and of self-esteem. Furthermore, there was a concept relevant to the study of boredom in a different manner. A concept covering not so much emotions deriving from not being active, but the situation of not being active itself. Yet these concepts, very similar in Greek and Roman thinking, also primarily relate to a definition of activity as a public activity. The state of not engaging in any publicly relevant activity was called scholae in Greek and otium in Latin. Both terms mean quite exactly spare time, time free of duties, or leisure. In Latin, quite strikingly, all public or economical activities are accordingly called non-leisure, negotium. This concept of leisure was extremely important for elite self-definitions in ancient societies, since it was the elite's material wealth that allowed them to cultivate activities beyond economic subsistence and even abstain from economic work at all. If the negotium of middle and lower classes consumed most of their lives through the necessities to secure their livelihood, and that means hard work, the wealth of the rich citizen allowed him to engage in politics as a public duty, as their form of negotium, while their otium gave the elites the freedom to spend time with activities that would distinguish them from others as a class of gentlemen. Otium, thus, is an absence of public duties that was understood as the freedom to engage in hunting, in bodily exercise, or in education and philosophy. And on a side note, hence the modern derivative of the Greek term scholae, school. In the self-depiction of members of such elites, spare time is always understood to be spare time for activities that define their aristocratic personae. And again, to talk about one's own inactivity in terms of boredom would mean to negate one of the most important sources of public and of self-esteem. Now, what all of this means is that we cannot expect to find many, if any, explicit statements about individuals experiencing boredom in the Greco-Roman world. That, of course, does not mean that people did not experience emotions similar to our notion of boredom. It's just that such emotions were not usually expressed in those types of texts that survived the millennia, and not in ways that we might expect them to be. What we might look out for, however, are implicit cases, in which something that might look like boredom without being explicitly described as such seems expressed. In such cases, we need to consider whether what we see can be described as a form of boredom or something similar to it. And if that is affirmed, then we need to ask for the reasons why that image of boredom was expressed in the type of texts we are reading. And what I will try to show in the case study of Cicero is that a functionalized, metaphorical expression of boredom within one field of action can be read as an indirect documentation of the general cultural meaning of boredom in this case, the Roman world, the Roman Republican world. So up to this point, I'm aware that these were rather abstract theoretical ramblings. Let's get down to earth and jump into the type of texts I want to discuss. On the 8th of March in the year 47 before the Common Era, the consular Marcus Tullius Cicero sent a letter to his long-standing close friend Titus Pomponius Atticus, with whom he had exchanged several hundreds of letters in the decades before, and almost as many in the years to follow up until his death in 43 BCE, all of which have come down to us because Atticus decided to publish them after Cicero died as a document to his friend's political career and his life. In the short letter of March 8, Cicero instructs Atticus to take care of some financial transactions that he could not carry out on his own during his absence from Rome. Cicero stayed at Brundisium, modern Brindisi at the time, and he was unable to leave the town because of the regulations that Gaius Julius Caesar had taken concerning his enemies in the civil war after they were defeated in the Battle of Pharsalus on August 9 the year before. I will come back to these circumstances in an instant. Let us first have a look at what makes this letter interesting for us, if we are looking out for expressions of boredom. This is how he opens the letter. Taken down by the agony of this my greatest sorrow, I could not easily carry it out to write anything to you, even if there was something that I should need to. And I can even less so now that there is nothing to write, and there is not even a faint germ of hope that things might get better. Therefore you at least should write, if there is anyone to whom you can give it. I myself do not have anything to write back to your latest letter, although it has already been a while since I received it. Since after this long interruption I realize everything is changed. Deservedly, things for those people stand fast and firm. And for my stupidness, the gravest punishment is imminent. Oh, sorry. The introduction of this letter carries the whole weight of the depressed situation Cicero finds himself in. He mentions his sorrow about the political situation as well as the danger he believes himself to be in. All of this, he states, deprives him from any motivation to write anything significant, as well as of the ideas of what might be significant in the first place. He therefore simply hopes that maybe Atticus might write something that provided any new information or outlook. The rather depressed, motivationless tone of this introduction, strangely to us, does not prevent him to then seamlessly move on to financial matters and to very specifically give Atticus a number of instructions about them. All traces of depression immediately gone. Things are so bad, there really is nothing to write. Here's your list, your to-do list. Do it now. This striking proximity of statements expressing an absolute lack of ideas what to write or think, and then very specific and in some letters extremely lengthy, sometimes often quite boastful descriptions of his own private activities or plans is what is of interest for me in my analysis. Cicero does not explicitly speak of boredom here. He does not use a single term that would make this letter appear, if one were to research, for example, expressions of boredom by digital text mining. He doesn't use the terms that we would think were stood for the concept of boredom. But the way in which he, in this letter as well as many others, explicitly writes about not having anything to write when in fact he is writing all the time, strikes me as an oddity that begs explanation. If I had given you just the introduction to the letter without the connecting part to the rest of it, I believe that the passage on the slide may have appeared to you as an expression of something in between, say, situational boredom caused by an impasse in Cicero's life, or outright an existential depression about the political situation. Yet that is not the case if we look at the fuller picture, not only of this letter, but of all the many letters in which Cicero uses statements like this. In the whole of the corpus of Cicero's letters to Atticus, such statements are included in dozens, exactly 41 cases alone in the letters to Atticus. And there are far fewer in other types of letters, so it's mostly something he uses when writing to Atticus. He not always uses them in contexts that seem to express depression. There are some instances in which he just simply seems to have nothing to say. Those instances certainly have little to do with the case of the letter we have looked at, where the inability to write of anything significant is clearly framed by statements of political despair. Some of these rather unpolitical instances seem to stand behind, some of these instances use the statements even as an expression of appreciation of Atticus' letters. In such instances, the gist then would be, I don't have anything to write, nor may you, but even your insignificant letters bring me joy or assure me of your friendship. So those two types of uses of the unable to write statement are of lesser interest for us. There is a third one, however, and that appears in high frequency in times at which Cicero felt politically disconnected. There are four particular moments. There are four particular moments in which he seems to use that third type of having nothing to say. The first one is the triumvirate of 60 BCE, which surprised Cicero and deprived him of his political agency. Then, as we've seen, he is in his hideout at Brundisium in 47 BCE. Then there is a time of mourning because his daughter Tullia had died, and he retreats to a town called Asturia in 45 BC. We will see that later. And then there's a couple of weeks of the assassination, after the assassination of Caesar, when Cicero had realized that no restoration of the Republic might follow, and he could do nothing about it. Those are the four moments in which Cicero very often uses a political form of telling his addressee that he had really nothing to say. Now let us return to the situation in Brundisium. During the first year of the conflict between Caesar and Pompey, Cicero had tried to keep himself out of trouble. Eventually he had joined sides with Pompey, which rendered him on the losing side in the Battle of Pharsalus. After that battle, Caesar followed Pompey, who had flown to Egypt. And just when Cicero had hurried back to Italy and reached the port of Brundisium, Caesar issued a decree that allowed his former opponents to come to Egypt and later Africa to negotiate individual terms of agreement with him, thus escaping his wrath. This decree, however, did not extend to Italy, from where no one was to leave, so Cicero found himself stuck in southern Italy, unable to reach his own estates because Caesar's supporters roamed the land, and unable to gain an agreement with Caesar. And it is this exact situation, which should last for a couple of months, that Cicero addresses implicitly in the opening of his letter that we have just seen. Several other letters from Brindisi contain further instances of the unable to write statement, often shorter and less obvious in their political context. Taken as a whole, the political context seems present everywhere. On March 8th, the same day he wrote the letter we just saw, he repeats in a second letter that Atticus' letters always contained something for Cicero, even if they did not contain anything worthy of writing. And he adds that there was also nothing to write to Caesar's governor in Italy because Mark Antony might not want to talk to him. More than 3 months later, on July 22nd, Cicero is still stuck in Brundisium. Now he writes, "When I had the opportunity to give a letter to your people, I did not let it pass, even though I had nothing to write. You on your part are writing less often than you used to, and shorter letters, because you do not have anything, I believe, that I might in your expectation like to read or hear. Still, I wish you would write, whatever there be, and however it be. For there is only one thing that I can wish for, that it might be possible to somehow negotiate for peace. Yet I do not have any hope for that. Now, since you at times hint carefully at the possibility, you do force me to hope for that, for which one can hardly wish at all." Well, that's almost the full letter. Cicero only mentions after that he heard some news about the return of a freedman to Italy, and then finally mentions, very unspecifically, that his time in disconnection from politics and Brundisium finally gave him an opportunity to take care of his own private affairs. Now, is he bored? Obviously not. He hints at private activities that, and many other letters show that clearly, that could even be quite urgent and time-consuming. But he contrasts this to being disconnected politically, and it is because of this disconnection that there is really nothing to write about. So what we seem to encounter here is a kind of hierarchy of activities to be addressed in the letter. So when during the fall of winter 47 to 46, Cicero finally reached the agreement with Caesar and returned to Rome. And then there is 18 months where he would not use that phrase that he had nothing to say. He's back to political life. In the fall of 46, then, he got divorced from his wife Terentia, and then he withdrew from Rome again, now to his private estates, arriving at Tusculum in fall. In February, however, Cicero's daughter Tullia died in childbed, and and he fled to an even more rural environment at Astura in southern Latium. In several letters from Astura, he expresses the depression and mentions the solace that he found in the solitude of his rustic refuge, as seen in the text on the slide. Again, while Cicero this time willingly disconnects himself from public life, he rushes into private activities and lays them out in full detail in the many more than daily letters to Atticus from Asturia. He has his friend take care of the legal and financial details of his divorce, as well as the failed marriage with a young girl he had planned during the winter. Acts on behalf of several of his acquaintances, and most importantly, gives very detailed accounts of his intellectual activities. Even in his philosophical studies, his book projects, even in the depression of the loss of his daughter, the elite Roman has to demonstrate his activity. Not as a politician, that would be indecent, but as a philosopher, because philosophy is not only an important aspect of elite lifestyle, but it also teaches the distinguished Roman to find consolation in mental activity, or at least to demonstrate that he would find that even when he didn't. One might even say that writing letters itself for Cicero is an act of demonstrating his activity under circumstances in which he is forced to or decides to be politically inactive. From Astura, in the midst of his busy life as an author and private entrepreneur, comes a letter that strongly seems to apply boredom in this context. From your letters I can sense, just as you can sense from mine, that we really do not have anything we could write. Day after day it's the same, and this is gradually wearing itself out. Nonetheless, I cannot but send letters to you daily, just so I might receive yours. In a way, this statement of the boring flow of a time spent in motionless dullness certainly still is meant to reflect his time of mourning. But considering the bustling activities that he describes in other letters of the same period, the dullness implied here once more proves to be a purely political disconnection. Uninvolved in the public of the capital, Cicero has nothing of relevance to write to his friends. And in terms of politics, the days wear off unchanged, unused. In another letter, Cicero even introduces the idea that such times during political inactivity rendered the days longer than politically active times. This is quite literally German Langeweile. However, this does not mean he described himself as inactive. Only his activity is now developed in a different field, as declared in a letter written on May 7th. Just a day before he will again use the trope that he had nothing to say. You write your opinion that I should finally let it be seen that my spirit has been recreated, and that some are talking about me in a harsher manner because of his inactivity than you or Brutus would want to write. Well, if those who believe that my spirit was broken or weakened knew how many and what type of texts I am composing, I believe that if there are humans at all, they will reckon that either if I was as relieved as to apply a liberated mind to the writing of difficult matters, I should not be blamed, or if I had chosen that as a distraction from my pain, which is most dignified for an educated gentleman, I even deserve to be praised. So the most important channel for the self-declared high-potential Cicero to direct his potential for activity to is the studying and writing of philosophy whenever he's not active in politics. That at least is what he wants others to understand. The more hopeless the political situation, the more letters are spent on describing the many book projects he was working on, and the more often he asks Atticus to send him more books to study. The unable to write topos in Cicero's letters, as I hope has appeared from these examples, is document not exactly of an all-encompassing situational boredom. Cicero is far from being bored. He rather seems to be quite busy, and sometimes he even states that his absence from politics finally allowed him the otium to turn to other, less public activities. Yet taken in itself, for the political animal that Cicero professes to be, who excels when speaking on the public stages of Rome, the disconnection from politics is a bore in the sense of ennui, an inactivity that is upsetting and a challenge to one's identity. Even when he is engaged in philosophy or in buying lands for building a sanctuary to his own person, so to become a god, Cicero still essentially remains and describes himself as a politician. That is, regardless of his many activities, the disconnection from the forum means that nothing is really happening and that there is nothing to say or write or expect to hear that would not amount to a wearisome series of irrelevant days spent in Langeweile. Now, is there a way out of this dullness? There is one letter written after his return from Astura to Tusculum in May 45, in which Cicero seems to be taking a chance by engaging in political writing, a political activity that he can pursue from a distance. And with this, I want to close. He now had taken on a challenge posed by others who asked he should write a political pamphlet, an open letter to Caesar reprobating his tyrannical regime. By May 23rd, he had sent a draft of this for comment to Atticus, and now he writes, "Once you've inspected those gardens," that's the lands where he wants to build the temple to his person on, "and once you have sent me word concerning the open letter, you will have provided me with something to write to you. As long as you haven't, I will write nonetheless, since there will never be a lack of something to write." Now, I hope that even though this paper was slightly too long, I figure, there may be something to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. for this very interesting presentation. Is any question? Do you have to share some comment with Thomas? Yes, Marius?
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. This is quite an interesting, especially starting point for me, yeah, because this is the most general one. And I suppose we still miss the history of boredom, yeah. We had the not quite scientific, but popular book about this boredom, a lively history, but this is not the history of boredom, yeah. And you started with this cultural history, and I think about history of emotions. Yeah, this is a newly established field. Yeah, and I suppose this is a good starting point. Yeah, because we had some clues from ancient Greek, from ancient Rome, about Academia, about Te Deum Vitae, Horolozi, and similar. Yeah, but this would be quite nice to have this general, I don't know, is it theory or a paradigm? Yeah, to just contextualize boredom within this history of emotions field. Yeah, this could be quite nice. Yeah, to have it gathered in one place. Yeah, because what you say, what you did is a nice case study. Yeah, let's call it like this. Yeah. But your starting point is quite impressive, I suppose. Yeah, maybe this is the I'm waiting for a decade, I suppose, for something like this. Yeah, this gathering all those pieces as a historian. Yeah, because I'm not a historian. Yeah, I'm a sociologist, so I don't have these tools, methodological tools. Yeah, intellectual tools, and so on. So it would be a nice starting point. So thank you for this.
Thank you. I might just add that, like, when I found out about this society, so it was not through like any personal contact. I just somehow found you on the net, on the web. And when I found out, of course, I read like, what are you doing? And I read that like philosophical and historical aspects were addressed like in the general just descriptions of the society, and I had the same feeling. So you can study the concepts on the one hand, but if you are looking from a contemporary perspective for the history of a concept, you will normally you will run the risk to select the material so that it only resembles the context that you're starting from. And I would say this should be supplemented by an approach that that does not like presuppose that there was like a coherent development of like proto-boredoms or something like that, even though such traditions do develop and exist, but that there might have been quite different related expressions of emotions that do not really match what we are talking about when talking about boredom, but still are related and thus relevant for the development of the concepts themselves. And that's what I try to do with Cicero somehow, because like in of course the sources that we have are mostly from such political annals that we have, at least the narrative sources. But where do we have genuine expressions of emotion? If at all, one might look into letters. That's how I came to look into Cicero. It would be interesting to look into the papyrological letters, because those are private letters from really normal people. But it's a very sparse, fragmentary material, and it's a very daunting task to look into something that you do not really know whether or not you will find at all, or if you will recognize it if it's there. So it's really a challenging topic. So there might be a reason why this does not yet exist, particularly for rather ancient history. Mm-hmm. But it also might be wise to
if you know the Minois book, the French historian, about the history of melancholy, and this is quite interesting starting point there, that this is the evolution of concept. Yeah, so we started, okay, now the melancholy is medicalized. yeah, as something medical, yeah, like illness, like depression. Yeah, so we started here, and then we saw the whole history, the whole story, evolution of the concept that we reach today's concept. Yeah, you know what I mean. And the second thing is that we
Marius,
can.
this is what I tried to do with my book.
Yeah, okay. So I must read it. Is it in English? Yeah, already.
It will be published the next year.
The next
at the very
year, okay.
beginning of the next year.
Okay. So
And it's
I will be
just
extremely
trying to
bored
read this book.
waiting for it. Yeah. And the second thing I'm thinking of is research symptoms. So this is the approach that Daniel Ute did with sleeping in the church. This is a great paper about the sleeping. Yeah, sleep can be maybe symptom of boredom sometimes in some context. Yeah, so probably we have this symptomatology here and there in papers, yeah, in historical sources. This is my idea as well.
Like falling to sleep out of boredom. There's one little story that immediately comes to mind. It's in the Pauline letters. Paulus just refers that he was like preaching in. I would have to look up which Christian assembly it was.
In Acts.
So he was
Acts. Mm-hmm.
It's in it might maybe in Acts, yeah, maybe, but yeah, it's reported. So he was talking about Christ and about how to organize Christian societies, and a young man who had seated himself like in the window fell asleep and just fell out of the first story and died. And Paul had to virtually bring him back to life with the help of Jesus, of course, and demonstrate like that he was really an apostle in that way. But just the event itself is not only strangely funny in the context, but it's also kind of expression of what you said about like what are the symptoms actually, and Paul seems to have just talked too long.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, if I have some time, I have a comment and maybe a question plus comment. First of all, I wanted to share that, do you know, Thomas, I recently published a book with the philosopher Andreas Erpidoro,
Okay.
which is titled, I'm gonna share my screen for you to see which is titled The History and Philosophy of Boredom, in which we try to cover some approaches from ancient times to this topic. And it's a pity because, we started planning this maybe 5 years ago, and it was recently published just this month. And it had been fantastic to have your chapter just in this first part, because there is no chapter devoted to Cicero. And it's very difficult to find this kind of research right now. So, well, it's a pity, but we will have your paper hopefully in our journal, which is even better. So now my question, I'm gonna read it because I'm not sorry if I'm missing something. Do you think, Thomas, one of the reasons of the contemporary experience of boredom today is that we as citizens are not involved with public and social affairs? I mean, in other words, to be involved in the ongoing of social and public affairs can be a remedy for boredom in a society in which we are living in a so individualistic way. And in case your answer is yes, how can we motivate people to get more involved in this way. How to convince people today that this might be a meaningful activity to occupy our time? Or maybe it's all the contrary. Maybe public affairs are so boring today that we have to keep looking for meaning in our private affairs and goals. Should we disconnect from politics? What do you think?
We should not. But yeah, thank you. Quite an interesting question. This is really the question is very typical for what I like in interdisciplinary work, because of my discipline, I'm always forced to think about the past, and it's very good to have that conversation. So in fact, yes, I would say that individualism and the modern notion of the private person are part of what triggers the experience and the expression of boredom as we conceptualize it. Talking about modernity, I always I like to use the image of like a cupboard with drawers. Everything is in their own drawers. There's the political life; it's in that drawer, and there is private life, and there's a German saying: "Dienst ist Dienst and Schnaps ist Schnaps." There's times for working and times for drinking, and both are extremely absolutely separate from each other. There's no connection to these. The problem is that cupboard doesn't exist in reality. It's just a concept of the mind. And so what I would say, what I would answer how to change that, I would say it's a matter of public discourse. It's a matter of talking about things. Because you could say the same, like disconnection from politics. Is that something we should achieve? Of course, there are good reasons to argue for securing separate private spaces. So I've just published a year ago. I published a book on religious groups in Rome and how they create their separate little spaces in society so they can establish different normative orders within those spaces. That's my book on religious secrecy. So they cut off communication to a certain degree, but still they also show to the outer world that they are there. They say, "Look at us, we do have a secret." So that's the social function there. But there is a reason to separate spaces, and you can argue for that well. But there is also a danger that you just retreat into that one drawer of the cupboard, and do not see that the cupboard is just only exists in your mind, and you are influenced by what's outside of that cupboard. And therefore, of course, we cannot want to withdraw into the private life. And individualism is, if we would call it an ideology, maybe that's a too strong a term, I don't know, but let's do it. If it is an ideology that bears the danger of triggering such a retreat. Because we do not want to belong to groups and such things. On the other hand, you can see that in antiquity, we find innumerous examples for that. They didn't have the cupboard. And they, like the private house was a political meeting space, quite typically. You could call that totalitarian in a manner. There are dangers to that as well. And that's why Cicero has nowhere to go, actually, when he is at Brundisium. There is no retreat into the private. He is a public figure wherever he is. And so we need to negotiate these two poles, so to speak.
I totally agree. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you very much.